Okay, so I'm here to talk about the estimation of parameters for the Irish dairy milk evaluation and some interesting problems that came from that. So probably a lot of people in this room have already moved to a test day model, but in Ireland we're still on a lactation model, a 3 or 5 day model, and the model that we have and the parameters were all estimated a dozen years ago at this stage, so there was a time for a change, I suppose, and as part of that there's been a change of the type of herd that's been recorded and also the methods of recording. Back in the 10 years ago there was more non-seasonal production, whereas now there's very much a seasonal production. Back 10 years ago there was more of a larger proportion of pedigree herds. There are now more non-pedigree herds. Also, there's been a move towards different recording methods, electronic DIY, guides recording less often per year, just 4 times a year. So there's been changes in the data recording out there. There was also a desire to move to in-house software. It's currently contracted out, or 3 or 5 day. And all of that led to the project to develop a test day model for the Irish system. And obviously the first step for that is to look at parameters. So that's what we'll start at. And there's probably 2 portions in what's left. One is the generic parameters, which most people have seen, and then we'll look at one specific angle in the Irish data, which is the seasonality. And as you will have seen from looking out the windows of the hotel or the bus, the production system in Ireland is very, very much pasture-based. So there's a very large seasonal component to the milk production system. So 2/3 of the dairy cows will calve in February, March and April, in 3 months in the springtime. And that's coinciding with the availability of grass. And that is only likely to increase over the next 5 to 10 years, probably for 2 main reasons. One would be price fluctuation. 2009 in Ireland was one of these so-called perfect storms where milk prices took a hammering, and we also had a very bad weather to go with it. So farmers that were on more a high input, high cost system took a serious beating on profitability that year, whereas the guys on the lower cost grazing system were hit less badly, we'll put it that way. The other thing that's come down the tracks very quickly is the removal of quota in 2015, and a lot of herds are planning on expanding, but expanding with minimum extra labour, and that's also obviously bringing in grazing systems rather than indoor feeding. And I suppose just to emphasise how important the seasonality is in the Irish system, in the Irish Total Merit Index, the Economic Breeding Index, there's a minus 12 euros economic weight for every extra day on a calving interval, just to stress how important that is. So the initial objective was just to estimate various components based on Irish data for a test day model, but the more interesting bit was look at the seasonality and see what effect, if any, that has on the parameters. So we'll start with the common or garden model without seasonality, and then in a few slides later on we'll come back to the seasonality. So the basic model, black and white animals, 90% of the cows here are black and white. Parodies 1 to 5, we took 4 traits, milk, fat and protein, test day traits and cell count. Used the Mix 99 software from the MTT guys. Went with an animal model, and because when the data is collected in Ireland, anywhere where you have one of these traits collected, the other 3 are collected as well. So for an initial model at least, we had no cross-trait correlation, so separate traits. We took 3 distinct genetic traits, so parity 1, parity 2, and then parity 3, 4 and 5 were the same genetic trait, parity 4 and 5 being a repeated record of 3. And like Timo did, we split our residual across the lactation into 12 blocks, which looked very like Timo's. We had 4 random regressions. We had an animal effect across lactation, a permanent environment. We had a herd curve, and then we had a last regression to model the repeatability, if you like, between parities 3, 4, and 5. There was a fixed regression on calving year, and then there was 3 fixed class effects of age at calving, days carried in calf, based on when she subsequently calved, and just a herd test day effect to pick up any variation there. So again, jumping straight on to results, we can see for the milk trait, our parodies 1, 2, and 3 in red, green, and blue respectively. And if we look at our heritability top at the left, we can see that these are very similar to the results that everyone else would have obtained. Our heritability starts at about 0.15, increases and dropped off. Now, the one thing that does come out as being slightly different to what others have seen, and the reason for that isn't 100% clear, is you would have expected parity 2 and 3, that's the green and the blue line, to be more similar than they are. Now, maybe that's a relic of our data structure, or maybe there's something in data. You can see that again down in your genetic variants on the right. You would have expected parity 2 and 3 to be more similar. They're close, but not identical. Again, the herd variance is one of interest there in a seasonal system. The most farmer impact will be at the beginning and at the end of the lactation, where there's early turnout to grass or late turnout to grass, early or late dry off. So maximum variation at the beginning and the end, and at the middle, very little. So using those parameters to compare with what our current 305-day model is giving us. So we just took the black and white animals again across the whole population and looked at how do these stack up with what we have already. And we just put in a general heterosis and recombination term just to pull out the Halson and Friesian separately. And they're stacking up quite solidly. And for example, on the AI sours, well-proven AI sours at greater than 90% reliability, the milk yield trait there's a correlation there of 0.93 between the old 305-day model and the new proposed test day model. And again, we see the other figures there, but even for cows, our figures there are roughly in the mid-80s. Now, the one that jumps out there as being a little bit low is protein, and that's one that, now these results are very recent, that needs some more research as to whether there is something else going on there. The other ones look quite similar, but protein does look a little bit low. So that needs more work. So that's the basic parameters. Again, nothing specifically new there. But the one thing that's different in Ireland is the seasonality, which I referred to earlier on. And again, I can't stress enough how big an angle that is on the production system here. So with that in mind, are there specific benefits to using specific bulls at specific times of the breeding season? So the way we looked at that is go back to square one again, examine the variance components, but not just looking at stage of lactation, but also look at month of production. So you're now looking at stage of lactation, which is in every model, a day in milk or a month in milk, but also include a test month, a month of the year basically. And the combination of those two terms will allow you to examine daughters of a particular bull calving in different months and whether they are the same or different genetic traits. And jumping straight on to the results from that, we can see that if we take, for example, our January calvers, now these are for a given bull, what his January calvers would do. And again, that's got by combining the month in milk and the test month. And you can pick out your diagonal basically across that matrix will give you your January calvers. And you can see that your January calvers, relatively speaking, they start at a higher heritability at the start of the lactation, and they reach a peak which is relatively lower and fall off towards the end. But as you move on toward the season, your February, March and April, when most of the cows will calf, the heritability profiles are not the same. So the later you calf in the year, the lower the initial heritability is, and it rises to a higher heritability. So that's suggesting that, yes, there is something in this seasonality at this stage at least. The dotted line across the centre is if you take the previous model where there is no seasonality, and that's roughly midway between the 5 months that are included there. So at this stage it looks quite promising that, yes, there's something in there. But we're not finished yet. So we now have a genetic component attributable to a month in milk, stage of lactation, which is what you would always have. But we also have a separate component attributable to month of the year, basically, test month. So we will pull those apart and look at them separately and see how the variance is attributable to each of those, and also how the correlations across either the year or across the parity vary. And we start with stage of the lactation, and we look at daughters calving early in the lactation, again 2 months into the lactation, midway through the lactation, 5 months in, and again out at the tail end of the lactation. And our variances down our diagonal are reasonably consistent and falling off towards the end of the lactation. Again, nothing too drastic there. And if we look at our off diagonal, we see our correlations, and again, they're quite strong as you move from month in milk 2 to month in milk 5, early to mid lactation. They're still up at 0.888, still quite strong. And even if you go from very early to very late, you're still up at 0.73. Again, nothing particularly new about that. But the interesting bit to come now is that's our month in milk component. If we now look at our test month component from a similar point of view, what will that show us? And this time we'll start with the off diagonals. The message is easier to build up to that way. And if we look now, we're not looking at stage of lactation, we're looking at month of the year. Again, we've pulled apart the genetic component attributable to stage of lactation compared to that attributable to month of the year. So we're looking this time at an April milk test, a June milk test, and a September milk test. Test month 4, 6, and 8, respectively. And if you take 2 months that are only 2 apart from each other, April and June, your genetic correlations have already dropped quite dramatically. You're already below 0.5. And if you go between June and September, a little bit wider gap, again, the correlation has dropped to 0.3, so it's dropped even further. And if you look between early in the year, April, and relatively late in the year, the correlation has gone strongly negative, minus 0.71. So again, this is suggesting, there is something in here. But, and again, you've probably guessed where I'm going with this by starting with the off diagonals. The variance down the diagonal, relatively speaking, is very, very small compared to the previous slide. So yes, there is an effect of the test month in there, but big picture, it's being swamped by the stage of the lactation. So yes, there is an effect, but it's a very small part of the overall. So just to tie this all together, what we then did was we took those parameters and we took 20 bulls in that data set. We took bulls with more than 20 progeny and looked at what's the correlation between a whole milk lactation, because at the end of the day, that's primarily what a farmer will be focused on. And if you looked at the model including seasonality, and the standard model, if you like, not including the seasonality, the correlations between the predictions of a milk yield EBV were very, very strong. They were greater than 0.996 in all combinations of the January, February, March calvers and so on, and no seasonality. And in the persistency, it was lower. And again, that you'd sort of guess from the heritability profiles earlier on, that there is difference within the lactation, and the persistency is picking up that. So between the May calvers and the no seasonality, the correlation for persistency was down at 0.93. The other ones were above that. Also, if you looked at your log likelihood, it would suggest that the standard model without seasonality is probably the preferred model. So all of that together suggests that yes, there is a seasonality angle in there, but it is basically being swamped by the stage of the lactation. So with that in mind, the seasonality won't be included in the parameters. It's giving us very little extra. So the plan where we go from here is with this initial run, we hope to make an interval test run in September as an initial run, and then basically build on the model. Obviously, it's just an initial model for now, and these are a few of the things that we would have to build on before we have a final model. Aged calving across breed, things like that. At the moment, there's a general heterosis and recombination term in there. In Ireland, there's some specific crosses. There's Jersey crosses and some Scandinavian crosses, very much in evidence of late. So look at the specific heterosis from those. Again, the heterogeneity of variants, there are still some of these non-seasonal producing herds. There's still 10% of year-round herds, so make sure we correctly deal with those. And the one I think that's going to be very big in the Irish context, again, the seasonal context, is persistency, because there's already been a move by some of the processors in Ireland to slightly penalise farmers that overproduce at the peak in May and June, and slightly give a bonus for producers that produce extra in the tail end of the year in February and October and November. So there will be demand out there for bulls with flatter lactation curves. So that's one that's going to be very much of interest in an Irish context. And obviously there's a few practical considerations that we'll have to worry about when it gets to implementing this, but that's a little bit away yet. So thank you very much for your attention.